Welcome to the second part of our webinar series on computational pathology. Today, Dr. Pierre Moulin will delve into some of the technical aspects of computational pathology and its applications in diagnostic pathology. We hope that this particular webinar series has provided a catalyst to stimulate your interest in computational pathology, and clearly we are trying to host a webinar series which will be accredited and online for people who are really interested in delving further into computational pathology, and that's a series that we're going to develop in the not too distant future. So Pierre, over to you.
Thank you, Ranjan. I hope you can all see the presentation now. Yes?
Yes, we're good to go.
Okay, excellent. So yes, today we'll go a little bit more in details in some technical aspects. I'm not sure we'll have the opportunity to touch really on clinical applications per se, but nevertheless, there will be some clinical implications. I can't pass the slides, I'm sorry. There's something not going well here next. Okay, so what we'll cover today is first a little bit of the structure of digital images. Really what's in there when we transform a slide, or what we see under the microscope into a digital picture. We'll see the basics of image analysis, no programming, but really the big concepts about what's the workflow for a meaningful image analysis. And then we'll touch briefly on deep learning and try to understand a little bit better what's behind this concept that very often appears to us as a black box. Okay, so let's dive into the digital images. Essentially, when we are taking a digital picture of a slide or part of a slide, it doesn't have to be scanned. It can be a picture we taking at the microscope with a digital camera. We are creating an array of numbers that represents what we see. If we zoom into an image, we end up seeing small squares. We call that pixels. And these pixels, if we consider just a grayscale version of this image, these pixels are characterized by a position and a value. And this value represents the intensity of the light at the very point of the image that's covered by the pixel. So, of course, it's a bit more complex than that, because we are not dealing with grayscale images every day. We are dealing with color images, or even more complex images with multiplex immunofluorescence. So we need to introduce a couple of, or 5 concepts. First, the concept of channels. A grayscale image is a single channel image. It means that for each pixel, there is a single value of intensity. If we consider a color image, for each pixel, there are 3 values. They represent the red, the green, and the blue, as we perceive it also physiologically with your eyes. And then there is this idea that we can stack as many channels as layers as we want. For instance, to combine multiple grayscale images coming from different conditions of acquisition of a multiplex immunofluorescence image, for instance. There is all a little complexity around how we are rendering that, how we are presenting that to the viewer. But this is for maybe another discussion. The second important concept is resolution, is the amount of detail captured in an image. It's basically the pixel count. The higher the resolution, the greater the image detail. So images can be 512 by 512 pixels, 1 1024 by 1024, and so on and so forth. We can have gigantic images. This represents also the amount of information that's captured in the image. The magnification, and we tend sometimes to mix the terms. Magnification is how much the image is enlarged relative to the specimens. It corresponds to 10x, 20x, 5x as we see that under the microscope. But of course, when we talk about digital images, this is not straightforward to link a particular lens magnification to a size, the size of an image. And this link depends on many factors that represent every step between the slide illumination, the optical path, and the sensor in the camera. So it's probably something we want to avoid using when we talk about digital images, and we prefer to use microns per pixels and resolution. So what are these microns per pixels? It's the physical size of the pixel as we see it on the screen. So we can say exactly that a pixel is 0.25 by 0.25 microns, or a pixel at lower resolution represents 2 microns. It depends on the density, the physical density of the pixels in the image. Then the fourth concept is the bit depth. I know we are coming into something that's a bit more techy already, but basically the bit depth represents the number of possible colors or intensity values in each pixels can have in as powers of 2. You probably have seen, I'm sure everybody's playing with digital images, you probably have seen that typical values range between 0 and 255. Sorry. So it represents 8 bits. It's 8 to the power of, it's 2 to the power of 8, so 256, and the 0 is black, so we shift everything by 1. But 256 is usually or 8-bit is usually the depth we're dealing with for each layer. So for instance, a color image will have 3 times 8 bits. But if you're dealing with fluorescence or specific sensors, you may have 12 or even 16-bit to allow more precision, more granularity in the representation of the intensities or light. So yes, this is we've talked about it already. How do we represent color? We represent color like our eye perceives color. We perceive green, red, and blue mostly, with different sensitivities in the spectrum. And computers reproduce this representation in 3 channels, R, G, and B. So it means that a pixel doesn't only have a X and Y coordinate, so a position on the slide, but it has also, or on the image, but it has also a position in a cube where each axis represents the color, the fundamental color, red, green, and blue. And we have an example here how a H&E, very high magnification, very pixelized H&E image looks like in color, and when it's split into red, green, and the blue component. You can also already see that the red is very light in the red component and appears relatively dark in the blue component, whereas the green component gives us a fairly nice representation of the intensities. For those who used to shoot a micrograph at the microscope, especially black and white micrograph, you may remember we were often using a green filter to increase the contrast. Now, representing color with RG and B is one model. It's one possible model that we call the natural additive color model. It means that we are combining intensities in the specific 3 channels to produce any color we can perceive on a screen, on a monitor. It represents the light that's transmitted through the slide under the microscope. But if we want to print a picture, there is no light coming through the piece of paper. Instead, we need to use a subtractive model, meaning that we need to compose color in a way that only the pigments are reflecting the individual components and not just filtering them. That's why sometimes we move from RGB to the CMYK, so cyan, magenta, yellow, and black subtractive color model. It has a very different representation than the RGB, although they are theoretically complementary. But you can see that some of the pictures on the side here, although they are small, are very saturated. This gives you also a sense of how tricky it can be to adjust the image parameters for a reliable representation on paper. And that's why also when you're loading your printer, you have to load 4 cartridges and not only 3. Now there are more color models than the RGB and CMYK. We have also color models that are somewhat closer to the physical quantities we used to consider when we are talking about color, that is wavelengths. We know that in the 600-700 nanometers, we have the red, the far red, and as we move towards the 400 nanometers, we are reaching the blue and the violet. And this is not represented directly in the RGB model. We need to transform the RGB model into this model that's U, saturation, and value or light. The U represents the visible spectrum, a little bit as the wavelength. The value represents the intensity of the light. And the saturation is representing the amount of white, pure white, we mix with the color. Think that these light, very intense green here have to be diluted by white to give you a pale green here. So you need a quantity that represents the amount of white, the amount of dilution you're bringing in the mix. And of course, in the middle, you have the pure white. So that's the HSV or HSL model. It's very useful for selecting specific stains and also measuring some of the intensities. And then we have other models that are different ways of representing RGB with some diagonals in the red-green axis or over the blue yellow axis. And these are lab or YCBCR. These are terms you may encounter once in a while. It's very much used in image analysis. Now, there is a caveat about all these models. We would be tempted to say, okay, well, I can go from one model, say RGB, and I'm to another one to perform some image processing. We'll talk about that a bit later, and then I come back. Well, the problem is some of these transforms do not have a are not completely reversible. Some of these transformations use functions like maximum of one value or the other, such that you cannot really go back to the original image with the same amount of information. So there is a little bit of loss of information. Now, this was about representation of the images in order to see them on the monitor. Now, we need to talk briefly about images and image files. Image files can be very complex. They represent the structure of the information as we write it on disk in order to store the image. And it's not straightforward to represent a square with X and Y coordinates. More so, multiple of these squares or rectangles, multiple of these layers in a linear file as it's written on disk. So there are many formats that are looking at, or they are exploiting several ways or several strategies to write different important elements of the images, or to indicate to the reader, now you have to jump over to this point in order to be able to start reading the red image, and you have to start to jump over to this point to read the green image. This is one possibility, especially in multiplex files. Now, for long, disk space has been very expensive. So another trick people use to store images is to compress the files. And obviously, compressing the file reduces the information. If you think of a 1000 by 1000 picture with three layers to represent a RGB image, you need to store 3 megabytes. And obviously, we have experienced that small pictures we are taking with our phone or with cameras are not that big on disk. We don't really know how much space they take in memory, because we are not exposed to these quantities as a regular user. But we need to understand that the amount of memory needed to display an image can be huge. But on disk, they take much less space. And this is because many file formats are using compression and chopping of the information. The most famous compressing algorithm for images is JPEG. And JPEG plays us some tricks, visual tricks, in order to remove the amount of to remove the information that's not visible by the human eyes, or not perceptible by the human eye. They're using several strategies. First, to transform the initial picture RGB into a different model that's more amenable to compression. And then this is very important. It's breaking or chopping the image into squares of 8 by 8. And if you pay attention now, you jump on your next virtual slide or picture, and you zoom in, you'll see these 8 by 8 square. It's barely perceptible, but it's there. The information in these squares has been transformed again to remove, in a way, the less relevant information. And the slide or the picture is encoded along these zigzag raster. So it's very complex, and we tend to forget that this is happening. But if we can't perceive or barely perceive the effect of compression, keep in mind that when we are doing image analysis, we can be hit by this compression in undesirable ways. Now we need to talk about the whole slide image. So far, we've considered 1000 by 1000, or in the order of 1000. But think of the size of a complete slide at most scanners 20x, 0.25 microns per pixels. We are talking about an image of 100,000 by 60,000 pixels in 3 layers. That's huge. If you want to consider the full size of the image, it doesn't fit in the memory of your computer. Therefore, the files that are encoding these whole slide images are made out of pyramids that correspond to the different magnifications we are likely to use when we are browsing the slide. So depending on the type of scanner you're using, say you have a full resolution that has 0.25 microns per pixels, some scanners will encode a 0.5, 1, 2, 4, and some scanners will jump by steps of 4. But this allows the viewer to fetch the field of view at the optimal resolution for displaying it to you when you are at a given magnification without clogging the memory of your computer. Now we know a little bit more about I hope we know a little bit more about the structure of the images and some intricacies around digital images. It's time to think about image analysis. And I'm not talking about deep learning at this stage, but really the basics of how does a computer program extract information from an image and returns quantities to us that are useful for a clinical decision, like the proliferation index by Ki67 or PDL1 expression. In general, there are four steps. There are 4 key steps in image analysis. And it's valid for many aspects of image analysis, and it's particularly the case here for histological image analysis, probably very much so analysis of immunohistochemical signals, singleplex like DAB immunostaining. And the illustration here is an islet of Langerhans stain for insulin. So it's a good playground to start with. So we start with a digital image. We need to do a little bit of signal processing, optimize the signal in order for us to be in the best conditions to extract the relevant information. This is pre-processing or processing. Then there is the next step is segmentation. And segmentation means that from the image, I'll get only the pixels that are of interest. In this case, I'm not very much interested in the pixels that cover only hematoxylin. I'm interested in the pixels that represents DAB. So after the processing, I'll be able to separate those two and possibly find the contour or the region that corresponds to my pixels of interest. And later on, I'll be able to measure properties of these pixels, provided that I've gone from identifying the pixels to grouping them into histologically relevant objects, say individual cells, or tumor stroma, or islets in this case. So the pre-processing has a lot of impact on the quality of the analysis and also can produce some unwanted effect. So it's a critical step. We need to understand it very well. We talked about the digital image as a RGB representation. What we are dealing with is hematoxylin and eosin, or hematoxylin and diamidobenzidine. Those are colors that are not pure red, green, or blue. This introduces the concept of staining vectors. It's possible to look at the RGB cube and find directions in this RGB cube that represent the pure eosin, or in this case, DAB and hematoxylin. These are the staining vectors, and what you can see here, I hope it's readable, it's the projection of these staining vectors along the green, red, and blue axes. So you can transform the image, turn the cube on one of its vertices, and project it on pure hematoxylin and pure DAB axes, such that you're obtaining images that represent these stains. So of course, this depends on several factors. It depends on the characteristics of the camera or the characteristics of the scanner, what we call the color profile of the scanner. It goes a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to discuss today. It's a bit complex, but know that there is an influence here. And it also depends on the quality or the characteristics of your stains. If your hematoxylin is a bit grayish, or if your DAB is reinforced with osmium tetroxide, for instance, they will look different. And so we need to take this into account. We also face the problem of uneven pictures. We have pictures that are a bit darker, where there is less contrast, more contrast. And we want to adapt maybe the brightness and the contrast of our images. We need to do that sometimes to compensate for variations. But you can imagine easily that these operations change the values in the image dramatically. So if we do that, we need to make sure that we are doing that systematically and that it's recorded. Second, if we want to measure the intensities, we need to consider carefully the influence of these operations on the final readout. The segmentation is basically cutting through a processed image to determine what's in and what's out, what's blue, what's brown. If we plot here a histogram with the intensity of DAB, the intensity is in the x-axis, and in the y-axis here, as it's the distribution, you see the number of pixels that have a particular value or fall in the bin of a particular set of values. In this case, the smaller value of DAB, the lesser amount of DAB is probably the background, and higher values represent the signal. So we want to cut between the background and the signal. This is what you observe with a transformed image, where we've converted RGB into hematoxylin and DAB. If you're looking at the native image, for instance, the green channel, the dark values represent, the low values represent what it's dark, and the high value represents what it's light. Whichever direction we're taking, by cutting through this, histogram, we can separate the pixels that are of interest, and they are here labeled in white. So all of a sudden, we have a complex images turned into a binary masks. Pixels of interest are set to 1. Pixels of no interest are set to 0. So we just take those that are set to 1, and we can start measuring things, measuring at the object level, so at the individual bags of pixels. What's their shape? What's the signal intensity behind the mask? What's the distribution of the signal? The signal. We can even calculate the optical density and apply the Berlambert law to have a hint into how much antigen or how much target protein we have behind it. We can look at the region level, the distribution of the different objects, the local density, the spatial proximity. This is something that's very fashionable for the moment with spatial biology. But at the end of the day, spatial biology is a particular readout of image analysis on histology. And we can also look at the slide level and in order to get a single number that represents the slides. And this is very useful if we are studying cohorts of patients, or even simply if we want to have a single number to see where the patient sits. Okay, so I see we've taken a bit of time on the image analysis. Let's talk about deep learning. The big difference, that the big revolution that arose in 2016, 2017, is that at that point, we had tools that saved us from imagining how we want to process the image and what quantities we need to measure in an image in order to extract meaningful information. Deep learning starts with neural networks. It's not something new. It's something that's been around for decades, but for several reasons, it didn't make it to pathology or computational pathology as the way as we see it now. The base element of deep learning, of a neural network, is a neuron. Sometimes we call it a perceptron. Basically, it's a unit that represents an equation. That's a unit where several inputs, here x1, 2, 3, are put together into a formula. And this formula gives a weight to each of these inputs. So if there are 3 inputs, there will be 3 terms here plus a bias and independent terms. If there are 1,000 inputs, there will be 1,000 terms in your equation. And a neural network is the aggregation of these neurons, these perceptrons, into a network, but the network is, for us, organized in layers. Means that the inputs are going into a layer of neurons or perceptrons that are not connected with each other. They are connected to the next layer. And we are piling up more and more and more layers. This is why we call it a deep neural network. The number of layers, roughly, I hope there is no data scientist on the call, roughly represents the depth of your network. And this network, the combination of inputs and processing through the different nodes, we call also these neurons nodes, are giving you the output you want. So in this case, we can't possibly indicate and put manually to each node what parameters they have. It's too big. We're talking about millions of nodes for some of the networks. So the game here is to identify a reference set. Say, for instance, in our case, we want to have images that represent a particular entity and images that represent another entity, and we want to train a network to differentiate these two entities. We are assembling a training data set where we have pathology where a pathologist has established the ground truth, say type A, type B. We forward it through the network. The network assigns a class to each of the training data. The difference between the class assigned by the network and the ground truth these differences are fed into a particular function, which we call the loss function, that represents the intensity of the difference or the intensity of the error. And this error is fed backwards through the network in order to adjust the weights and the biases, and repeatedly we will reduce the loss function until we reach a certain level of certainty, and we'll be ready to use this network for predictions. That's training. Once the deep learning model is trained with data, say tumor stroma or class 1, class B, class 1, class 2, then we send test or inference slides in order to obtain a result independently without retraining the model. So there are different ways of training model. As we alluded to initially, we pathologists can produce annotations or ground truth and train a model to accomplish a particular task that is reproducing or classification or segmentation. This takes a lot of data. It takes a lot of time to generate the annotations. And sometimes it's not very generalizable. It means that when we want to expand it to different tasks, it becomes a bit tricky. Then there are other approaches where we can use weekly supervision. We don't provide precise pixel level annotations, but instead we are providing an annotation at the level of the slides, and we have algorithms that compare slides that are one class and the others and manage to identify the places where the difference arises from. Lastly, which is very fashionable at the moment, is the self-supervised approach where data scientists and engineers are trying to overcome the scarcity of ground truth, because it takes us time and energy, by tricking the algorithm into or tricking the model into identifying pictures that are different from each other in the training set. Now, the problem we are facing with histology in particular, which probably other discipline of computer vision has not faced, is that we are operating at a wide range of resolutions. We need to integrate, and we see things like nuclei, and we see things like glands or even tumor versus surrounding or margins. So this represents a very big range to cover, and it's not easy to cover it with deep learning models. The initial deep learning models that worked very well in histopathology were convolutional neural networks. Quickly, what they do is to browse, to go over an image and learn edges or characteristics of the images from a large field to a representation that's ultimately a single vector of features. These models in general can be expanded to a certain point to cover range of resolution from 1 to 4, say. But we are limited to this by the size of the images we can we can inject into a computer, especially the part of the computer that does the calculation. So these are very powerful methods for tasks that are performed at a given magnification or at given MPP, for instance, for nucleus segmentation or identification of tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, or in a derivative of classification, which is segmentation, separate the PDL1 labeling from the background, for instance. But if we want to operate with a broader range of resolution, we need to invent something new. And this has been the focus of intense research in the past 3 years, I would say. This is the concept of a vision transformer. Vision transformers are models that turn small images from the original image into sequences or encode them and retain their X and Y coordinates. We can combine these at multiple magnification and generate much more powerful representations of pathology images up to the slide level. How they work is probably the subject also of another webinar. So I want to conclude here. I hope the introduction to digital images and image analysis and the brief coverage of how deep learning models work high level was useful. And I think as this is the third wave of change in our profession, it's critical that we embrace these technologies, these approaches, as we did for molecular pathology and molecular biology and molecular pathology. And this is our responsibility to understand how it works, like we did for molecular and cell biology. We need also to get involved. This understanding, this knowledge we're bringing, this expertise will develop together, will help us guide the development of tools that are relevant and efficacious or efficient to help us in our daily work. And it will also give us the elements to critically evaluate the performance, but also the design of some of these tools. And at the end of the day, it's like for any ancillary technique. We know very well the limitations of the antibodies we're using every day in the clinical practice. We know very well the limitation of the interpretation of molecular profiles, thinking about translocation profiles and these kind of things. So it's natural for us now to get involved into these digital and computational techniques and develop this capacity to critically review them. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope there is still someone online, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That was excellent. We've got a couple of questions, and as they filter in, I just maybe wanted to start. You mentioned supervised as opposed to, at the very end of the remit, self-supervised models, right? And I know in my fledgling career in AI development, we were annotating and, to great detail. Would you think that self-supervised models have now supplanted the need for detailed annotation?
Well, the self-supervised models are coming at an immense cost of data and compute power. And I think there are probably smarter ways. And I'm not saying that for the engineers. I'm saying that if we work together, and if the pathologist gets more into some of the details, we'll be able to develop more efficient ways of training models, and probably models that are fitting better to our needs and that are more generalizable.
Right. So would you say that there is a de-emphasis in the need for detailed annotations as we have?
There is a de-emphasis. There is definitely a de-emphasis for need of annotations, and there is a limitation to the annotations. For some lesions or for some stainings, you and I, Ranjan, will probably have a very poor inter-observer reproducibility if someone compares at the pixel level how we are annotating things, and you know there are things that there are diagnoses that are difficult. There are lesions that are difficult to outline precisely, and there is this misconception also on the side, on the engineering side, on the data science side, that there is something like ground truth that's pixel precise, and there is no such ground truth that's pixel precise. So we need to find elegant ways of combining the discrepancies or the inconsistency that's irrelevant. We'll do the same diagnosis. We'll probably outline roughly what's to be outlined. We may miss one or thing or the other, but at the end of the day, the consequences of these imprecision or discrepancies is minimal, if not and completely negligible for the outcome of the patients. And this is a concept that has not percolated in the design of training strategies yet, to my knowledge.
Right. So one of the questions here is that how does one deal with person-to-person variation of training and inter-observer differences, and how AI compensates for that?
Oh, wait. AI, how we deal with that at the level of training is by we can do inter-observer or inter-annotator reproducibility studies. Frankly, I'm not sure it brings us a lot. What's really interesting is to start with relatively coarse annotations or combination of models, pre-annotations, and then you're serving the results to a panel of pathologists, asking whether it's plausible or whether they agree with the outline. It's a different thing to have to actively label something or receive a pre-labeled image asking you whether you agree or not. And I think with this kind of approach, more geared towards plausibility and practical implementations, will make good progress with less effort, less tedious effort.
Right. Question from Shane. In terms of numbers, how many images are considered sufficient for training a model? Depends
on task. I'm sorry.
Sure.
It's not very satisfactory. So
let me give you a scenario. On Shane's behalf. Let's say we want to develop a model to read PDL1.
Oh, thousands. You can level slide level annotations in the hundreds, and probably the areas are in the thousands.
Okay, and so that would translate to thousands of PDL1 stained slides, right, Pierre?
Or pictures of PDL1 stain. Yes.
Great. Okay. Are there any other questions? If people have them, please pop them into the Q&A module. There's interest in the course, Pierre, so I think that's something we should press ahead with. And
yes, you can sense there is a lot to say probably for each of these slides we've gone through together today. We can go deeper, we can go into details, and I mean relevant details that are relevant for the audience as well. And as we learn together, we will probably get to points where we will be able to experiment the impact of subtle variations here and there on the final results.
Great. And then I think the last question we have for today is someone's asked a question about virtual staining. Do you want to quickly address that one?
Yes, this is it. There is a possibility to learn regions of interest or pixels of interest in a slide or in an image. especially in the context of a weakly supervised training model. So say, for instance, you're comparing slides of imagine a toxicology study in rats, and you have a marker for tubular injury. You can train a model that learns from very soft labels, like this slide has tubular injury, this slide doesn't have tubular injury. You can learn which area of the slide down to close to pixel level are likely to represent this tubular injury, and turn these predictions or these probabilities into a pseudo staining. So you would just create, for instance, a pseudo DAB stain that represent this probability.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm a huge fan of that, right? Of virtual immunohistochemistry.
Yeah.
And, you know, the ability to read off of the H&E and paint the slide with the relevant immunohistochemistry is...
well, it's possible. There is a huge potential there, not only to reproduce the immunohistochemistry. Of course, you can imagine that you're comparing two consecutive sections, one with H&E and one with your DAB, and you're training a model to learn the DAB from the H&E. That's a possibility. But think broader. You have two distinct entities, or clinically distinct entities, that morphologically are relatively similar, and you want to train a model that tries to learn how to differentiate these two entities. And after a certain training and a good classification of the cases, gives you the places, a labeling on the slide that indicates where the model has extracted the most relevant information in order to be able to make this distinction. Then you have a pseudo stain that is not linked to a particular molecular entity, but it's linked to a particular morphological pattern that differentiates your two clinical entities.
Absolutely. Two more questions. One from Carl Vermeulen, Cape Town. Hi, Carl. When tumor classifications are updated and say a new entity is split out of a group, does all the original material from the original group that was assessed need to be retrained? Yeah.
It depends. It depends if the original model is by its internal representation capable of separating the new entity. So it may, and I've seen that several times. You're training towards a particular task, and in fact, in order to accomplish the task, the model has to learn more features than you expected. And maybe these features, this new entity is somewhere described or in the model. You don't know it until you've looked for it, and maybe you just have to separate the two in a very easy way inside the model. Now, if it's not the case, you need to retrain.
Right.
And I like I wanted to make a comment on the tumor classification. I mean, for all the colleagues who on the call who think that this is still very complex stuff, it's much more simpler than the WHO classification of tumor.
That's true, especially in soft tissue. Question from Mariama in Canada. Hi, Mariama. Could you address challenges in cytology images, especially the PAP stain, given the importance of nuclear features for diagnosis?
I have to say I've not reviewed the most recent literature on PAP stain. What I can elaborate on is that scan slides of cytology are even more complex than the slides we've talked about, because you need you need a Z stack, you need several layers. What we've talked about regarding the JPEG compression and the artifacts it can induce may alter the chromatin identification or the extraction of chromatin features. I think on the more positive side, I think screening pap smears has been one of the first applications I've seen attempted by image analysis in production in the clinic. I've seen exemplars of that already, or prototypes already in 1995, 1998. So I think there are specific challenges, but there are also probably a very good case for a lot of the pre-screening done by a machine.
Right. Great. But I think in the not too distant future, cytopathology will be incorporated, as is surgical pathology, into the model developments. I think the technology is advancing quite rapidly.
Yeah.
The cytopathologists won't have any more excuses not to view digital images anymore. Great. Thank you once again, Pierre. That was wonderful. A great taster, as I said, and just a peek into this new field of computational pathology. As I've mentioned before, we will be doing a formal course, which will be accredited both online and in person, and details of that will be put out shortly. So once again, thank you all for attending, and thank you very much, Pierre. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Rajan.